For the last several decades, the British Labour Party has drifted to the right, exemplified by Tony Blair becoming Labour Party Prime Minister of the UK in 1997. Blair went on to team up with President George Bush in military invasions in Iraq and elsewhere, and domestically to weaken the public sector in the UK. Then, in September of 2015, just about everybody was startled when Jeremy Corbyn, firmly within the left wing of the Labour Party, was elected the new party leader. Reflecting a rejection of class collaboration within the Labour Party, a new generation of party activists have become Corbyn's base. We present two visits that Jeremy Corbyn made to the United States, then as a Member of Parliament representing Islington North. In these two segments, you will hear Corbyn's ideas about opposing imperialism, as well as socialist policies for working people. First, here is Jeremy Corbyn in 2007 addressing an anti-war assembly in Chicago.
Tony Blair leaves office on Wednesday. Now, the reason he leaves office is nothing to do with age, nothing to do with infirmity, nothing to do with anything like that. It is because of Iraq. It's because he followed Bush. That is the reason he's leaving. And I wanted to particularly commemorate his last day in office, and it's all very carefully choreographed. He comes into Parliament at 12 o'clock on Wednesday, answers questions for half an hour, and gets in the car and goes to see the Queen, because we live in a monarchy. You remember that. You had one once. He then tenders his seals of office, and Gordon Brown takes over. So I thought, I'll give it a go. I applied for a question to Blair, and I've got one on Iraq on Wednesday. Excellent. So his last day will be answering yet another question from me and others on when are the troops coming home from Iraq.
Jeremy Corbyn.
3, Mr. Speaker. Number 3.
The numbers of UK forces in Iraq depend on the conditions in Iraq. The numbers of forces have come down from 9,000 to 7,000 to 5,500. When in the next few weeks we are able to complete a further phase of withdrawal, they will come down even further. But they must come down as and when the security conditions allow. We have already handed over responsibility for several of the provinces that used to be under our control to the Iraqi forces. The 10th Division is now operating very effectively down in Basra, so we will be able to do more in the near future, but it must be dependent on the security circumstances.
Jeremy Corbyn.
I thank the Prime Minister for that answer. Would he recognise that in the United States the Congress has voted for the withdrawal of US forces and only a presidential veto is preventing that from happening, and that overwhelmingly British public opinion wants the British troops to be withdrawn and the occupation to end? Does he not think that it is time to give a timetable to bring the troops out of Iraq?
I'm afraid I don't, for the reasons that I have often given.
Ever since the war started in 2003, there's been many calls for an inquiry into the process that was behind the beginning of the war. Tony Blair met George Bush in April 2002 in Crawford, Texas. It appears that this was the turning point in the decision to move the whole war on terror away from Afghanistan onto Iraq. And throughout that summer there was a build-up of political forces on both sides of the Atlantic, and by September there were forces already in the whole region. The rest we well know, the arguments, the utterly fallacious arguments that were used about the existence of weapons of mass destruction, the decision to prevent Mohammed al-Baradei and the Hans Blix from returning to Iraq in January 2003, and then finally the attack on Iraq on March the 20th. Afterwards, there were inquiries held in Britain by the Foreign Affairs Committee of Parliament, the Defence Committee of Parliament, the Intelligence Committee of Parliament, and there were separate inquiries into the death of Dr. David Kelly and the Butler inquiry. Butler was the Secretary to the Cabinet. None of these inquiries received as much cooperation as they should have done. None of them actually went to the heart of the whole issue. So ever since then, we've been making demand for an inquiry. The most recent was a motion in Parliament to call for what's called a Privy Council inquiry. Under the British system is a thing called Privy Councillors. That it's a very historic title, but under Privy Council terms, they can give evidence that is not a danger to them personally if they give evidence, and this was one of many ideas. What we really want is an open public judicial inquiry into the whole process leading up to the war, specifically the claim of weapons of mass destruction, specifically the claim that the war was legal when clearly it was not within the terms of the UN Charter, and specifically the evidence given by the Attorney General to the Cabinet, which was apparently the evidence which was given to the Cabinet by the Attorney General that was apparently conflicting evidence on two different occasions. And so we are continuing to press for all that. But one has to be slightly careful. The inquiries are obviously important, and the history of the whole war is obviously very important, but the real issue is to stop the war and stop the killing and bring the troops out.
I believe it's the Foreign Secretary of Labour, the Labour Party. She gave this sort of really apologetic statement, like we can't be stopping to sort of question ourselves with this critical time when we have to succeed in Iraq. Is the notion of succeeding in Iraq still a live notion in Great Britain?
I've heard these arguments from Margaret Beckett, and frankly they're absurd.
That's what it's for.
They're absolutely absurd.
Yeah.
Firstly, let's just analyse the arguments for a second. Firstly, she said that it's impossible to have an inquiry while a war is going on because it's undermining of the troops. Well, there are specific references in British history where inquiries have gone on during a war. The Crimean War, 1854, there was an inquiry. The disaster of Dardanelles during the First World War, when particularly Churchill persuaded various Allied forces to mount a landing in Turkey, thinking they could cut Germany off from underneath, so to speak. Absolute disaster. Tens of thousands died. And during the Second World War, the Norway invasion, again promoted by Winston Churchill when he was First Lord of the Admiralty, was a disaster and a failure, and there was a parliamentary inquiry in public straight afterwards. The war was obviously still going on. It's a completely nonsensical argument. The other one is that success is happening in Iraq. Well, the British troops are now down to probably around 6,000 troops there, mostly confined to barracks, doing very little, essentially drawn down the operation a great deal. I don't know what she calls success to be. Occasionally we have television footage of soldiers going into schools carrying books and sweets, and it all looks very splendid. But then one hears the reality from the returning soldiers, the reality from some of the journalists. It's a complete disaster. I understand that over a 170-day period last year, on 150 days, there were mortar attacks on the British base in Basra. That is hardly a sign of a welcomed force that is there making great achievements.
Is there any hope now with the change in the Labour Party leadership with Gordon Brown coming in that this will mark a change for the party as a whole as to their attitude to the war? Obviously, the British public opinion has been against the war for a long time, and that hasn't been reflected in the leadership at the Labour Party. Is there any hope that this will change now with the departure of...
British public opinion has never been very supportive of this war, right back to 2002 onwards. Opinion polls have always been around 50% against the war, some cases much higher. It varies a bit from time to time, but generally one can take an average and it's a very large majority against. The damage to Tony Blair personally is massive in the case of the war. That is the reason he's leaving office. What I hope all this moves on to is that people in Britain and the USA realise that a foreign policy based on military supremacy, based on grabbing natural resources, based on stealing people's oil, is unsustainable, will lead to more wars and lead to more disasters. If we want peace in the world, we've got to think through very seriously the degree of isolation that both of our countries are suffering because of the war.
About a decade earlier, in 1996, Corbyn was an invited international guest to an organizing convention of the Labour Party in the United States, headed by Tony Mazzocchi of the Oil, Chemical and Atomic Workers. Here is Corbyn's speech to a group of delegates at that convention in Cleveland, Ohio.
I don't know how it seems to all of you, but to attend a conference in this city, preparing for the foundation of the Labour Party in America, is to me an extremely exciting occasion, and it's one of the most hopeful and inspiring events I've been to for very many years. We're constantly being told by a sort of world media consensus that the ideas of Labour solidarity, the ideas of socialism, and the history of working class struggle all across the world is something that dare not speak its name, and that these things have all got to be ignored in the face of the global economy. And the events of the past couple of days here have been truly inspiring for me. And it's also refreshing to hear from people in the United States a sense of the history of the labour movement in the United States, of Joe Hill, of Eugene Debs, of Sacco and Vanzetti, who I was taught about by my own parents, and great heroes like Karen Silkwood, and so many others that lost their lives in the struggle for freedom and justice and the struggle to develop a labour movement in the United States. And it's that sense of history that I find so inspiring here. I represent in the British Parliament a poor inner city community of North London, where there is 22% unemployment, and amongst young people probably 40 or 50% unemployment, and a serious housing crisis, and very many other things that go with it. And before I went into Parliament, I was an organiser for the National Union of Public Employees, organising public sector workers, many of whom were very badly paid indeed. And the history of the labour movement in Britain was that the Labour Party was established by the trade union movement 100 years ago because they couldn't trust the then Tories and the then Liberals, both bosses' parties, to represent their interests, so they founded a Labour Party to represent their interests. It seems to me that history goes on in very much the same vein in this country as well. But later on, the constitution of the party was developed. It developed a more socialist characteristic about it and became and still remains a very strong party indeed. And hopefully within the next few months, the British Tory government and all its works will be swept from office, and that will be a day of great rejoicing for a lot of very poor people. That Tory government, of course, is one that brought one of those fatal combinations, or half of one of those fatal combinations, to the world stage, namely the Thatcher-Reagan axis, which workers all around the world have much cause to regret. But the ideas of socialism and the ideas of workers' solidarity are constantly under threat. We're being told that all that matters is accepting the market economy and competition around the world. And indeed, in my own party in Britain, those very same forces are saying the way to electoral success is to reduce the radical content of the programme, to reduce the involvement of the trade union movement and accept the disciplines of the market. I frankly reject those arguments because they disenfranchise those that have suffered the disciplines of the market and have been defeated in competition. They disenfranchise the poorest people in our society. They weaken, not strengthen, our movement. What we need is to stand proudly by our trade union and labour movement history and stand proudly for the principles that trade unions and the labour movement throughout the world represent. That for me is very important. At the present time, there is a kind of world media consensus going on. You probably see it on your own television screens just as much as I do. This morning I turned on the television news here, and I just saw this piece that the Social Security Fund is going to be zero by the year 2029. So instead of a question as to why it's going to be zero and why all those people facing retirement at that time
are going to be left destitute. Instead, on comes a couple of sharp-suited experts to discuss how much money you'd need to be putting away now in order to provide for your own pension when you come to retire. And I understand that a 25-year-old young woman would need to be saving $750 a month from now till she retires at the age of 60 in order to have a reasonable pension. Well, that's more than many young people earn, never mind what they can save. And it's a complete negation of the whole debate about social justice to throw the responsibility of poverty in old age, as much as poverty at any other time, onto the individual rather than onto the vile system that creates the poverty in the first place. So we need to be campaigning against that kind of talk and that kind of thought. Now, in North America, you have been told that Nafta is the panacea for all ills. What's Nafta done? Cost jobs in the United States, cost jobs in Canada, created poverty in Mexico, lowered wages for everybody, given ever greater power to unaccountable multinational corporations. The convergence criteria that's being used in all the European countries to go towards a single currency is being used as an excuse to destroy the welfare state in France, in Italy, in Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, and every other country of Western Europe, where there are some very proud achievements of the labour movement of universal free health care, of state old age pensions, of unemployment benefit, of sick pay, and all those other kind of achievements are all now under threat. And the big, big threat to all of us is the general agreement on tariffs and trade, which creates the idea of a free market around the world to give power to multinational corporations to be unaccountable to anybody. The poverty that is created by GATT, both in the developed world and in the poorer world, is exactly the same process. I have before me here a copy of a magazine called Resurgence, produced by the Third World Network in Penang in Malaysia. And it says, countering the North's new foreign investment treaty. And you see the process by which multinational corporations close jobs in North America and Western Europe, move them to a nearby country where the wages are less. Mexico, Spain, Greece, whatever. As soon as the workers in Spain, Greece and Mexico start objecting to the slave labour conditions under which they are being forced to work, the company moves on to Malaysia, moves on to Indonesia, moves on to the Philippines, moves on to Central Africa, moves on to somewhere else, because always there is somewhere else to go to exploit people even more. And so the sense of attack on the working class people around the world, the attack on living standards of the poorest people, the creation of a gap between the rich and poor is something that we have to deal with. And it cannot be dealt with if the trade union movements and labour movements in each country look at everything from a purely national perspective. Are our enemies workers in another country, or are our enemies the company that is exploiting the workers in that country and in this country? I favour the internationalist argument. Because the internationalist argument is, to me, the one that is absolutely crucial to us. Because the attack that is being made on the living standards of people all around the world is a comprehensive and is a massive one indeed. There is a growth in the gap between the rich and poor in all the developed countries, and indeed that gap is getting larger, nowhere larger or faster than in Britain. The gap between the rich and the poor in the poorest countries of the world is getting larger and faster. The attack on trade union organisation is comprehensive all around the world. So we have an internationalism of the market. We have an internationalism of big companies. We have an internationalism of right-wing ideas that is there to destroy trade unions in the United States, destroy trade unions in Mexico, destroy trade unions in other countries. We have that sense of internationalism by the bosses. But what we need is that new, renewed, ever stronger sense of internationalism by the labour movement. We are facing a common enemy and a common ideological onslaught against us. And that, to me, is one of the things
that is so important about the establishment of a Labour Party in the United States. Because clearly, in every world forum, whatever the United States says has enormous influence. Indeed, it is total in the case of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. It's almost total in the case of GATT. It's very significant in every other international forum. The idea of a strong Labour Party in the United States that totally challenges those views of world domination by a small number of multinational corporations will have enormous impacts on every country in the world and every working class movement around the world. We're told that there is no opposition to this idea that we're all now part of the market. Well, it simply isn't true. We're not told about it on CNN, God bless them, because perhaps they haven't got time. They're too busy advertising hotels to be able to deal with that. We're not told about the degree of opposition to this whole process that does exist around the world. But everywhere I go and everything I read, what I find is there's tremendous struggles against union derecognition in the United States. There's tremendous efforts being made to organise workers in the tax-free zones and the likes in parts of this country. There is tremendous efforts being made to oppose the free market reforms, so-called, in Eastern and Central Europe at the present time. There's tremendous opposition to the GATT agreement in India and in Southern Africa. There is massive opposition to the cutbacks in the welfare state that exist throughout Western Europe. Our problem is, not that we're not doing enough, we don't know what each other is doing. And I hope that what comes out of tonight's meeting and of this week is a sense of understanding between people on both sides of the Atlantic and all continents of the world, that we're in this together, we're working together, but our strength has to be better communication and better organisation, the better able to control those multinational corporations that are doing so much harm around the world. Towards the end of this century that's seen the rise of fascism, that's seen the evils of wars, that's seen the evils of the arms race, and that now leaves us with a planet in which a quarter of the population of the world are literally on the level of starvation, another quarter have a life expectancy of less than 50, which would count out a lot of us in this room, and a quarter of the world's population living a slightly better, but in many cases very insecure standard of living. Surely all the ideas of the forerunners of the labour movements all around the world, those people with a socialist vision, those that laid down their lives for the development of a different kind of society, deserve something better at the end of the 20th century than a world so badly divided as this. I want us to go into the next century with ever stronger labour movements and the principles that lie behind them, to end forever the idea of child labour, to end forever the idea that so many people growing up in this world receive barely any education whatsoever. How many geniuses are being wasted away as they die on the streets of cities all around this world? How many people are we lost, the benefits of their genius is lost to all of us because of that? We can't go on allowing the world to be so divided into so many poor and so few rich. It's wrong, it's immoral, it's unjust, it's unsustainable, and it's killing this planet and killing all of us with it. And so I want us to have a sense of confidence and a sense of strength. Strength that there are many of us. Strength that we believe in something different and something better for this world and this society as a whole. And above all, the ability to achieve it. The trade union movement, because it exists on behalf of and part of what working people experience every day, is the only reliable democratic force that exists in the world. Because, at the end of the day, those people who make up trade union membership, who make up the labour movement as a whole, only can survive by relying on the collective sense of each other, collective provisions and collective security. That is why a Labour Party in the United States is such a tremendous step forward and will give so much hope to so many more of us all around the world. And I really do, from the bottom of my heart, wish you all the best with this endeavour. Thank you very much.